790 and the Vikings are trading peacefully. Whilst trading in Britain, they would have been made aware of these wonderful places called monasteries, which were filled with treasure, had no defences barring a few monks, and often sat right on the coast. Shockingly, dumping unbelievable wealth in easy to reach places attracted the attention of people who wanted such wealth, and in 793 a monastery called Lindisfarne in Northumbria was ransacked by seaborne raiders. Over the next decade, more of these raids occurred, with the monasteries of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow and Iona facing the same fate alongside many coastal settlements. So before we begin, the term Viking comes from the Old English word vikinger, which means pirate. Not all Vikings were raiders, however. Some were soldiers and nobles who simply served their lords much in the same way the Anglo-Saxons would have. For the sake of simplicity, the term Viking will be used to mean all Scandinavian soldiers and settlers who operated in Britain during this period. The Vikings consisted of two major groups. The first were the Danes from Denmark, who operated mostly in what is now England. The second group were the Norse from Norway, who focused on the northern coast of Britain as well as Ireland and Wales. The raiding continued in the decades following Lindisfarne, culminating in what is called the Great Heathen Army, landing in East Anglia in 865. The size of this army is debated, but it was the largest army the Vikings had ever assembled and was extremely potent. It was led by two men, Halfdan Ragnarsson, alongside his brother Ivar the Boneless. So the East Anglians paid the Vikings off and agreed to let them winter there, providing they didn't kill everyone. In 866, the Great Heathen Army headed into Northumbria and quickly seized Eorfavik, or York as it's now known. Incidentally, the reason that it was so easy for the Vikings to get to York was because they sailed there. Viking longships were considerably faster than walking or riding, and this was made even easier by the fact that the English coastline did not look like this, as it does today, but in fact it looked like this. The Vikings had arrived at an opportune moment because Northumbria was in the midst of a civil war which saw two kings, Ella and Osbert, try to outmurder each other for the throne. Upon realising the Vikings were in Northumbria, they both united their forces and marched on York, where they and their armies were swiftly butchered. After this, the Vikings placed a puppet king called Egbert on the throne, and many of the nobles of Northumbria fled north, which split the kingdom into two. The northern half had its capital at Bebbanburg, modern-day Bamburgh, whereas the southern kingdom was centred at York. Over the next couple of years, the Vikings marched through Mercia and they seized the important city of Snottingham, or Nottingham as it's now called. A combined force from Mercia and Wessex attempted to retake the city, but they failed. In 869, the Great Heathen Army went south into East Anglia again, but this time its king, Edmund, refused to pay them off and so met them in battle. Edmund was subsequently captured and executed, thus earning him the moniker Edmund the Martyr. In 871, some reinforcements arrived from Scandinavia and the Vikings turned their attention to Wessex. This invasion didn't come to much when the King of Wessex, Ethelred, defeated the Great Heathen Army before dying and being succeeded by his brother Alfred, who then paid the Vikings off. The Great Heathen Army continued moving up and down the country over the next few years, and Mercia was eventually toppled in 874. The Viking army then split up, with Guthrum heading south into Wessex and Halfdan taking his band north to fight the Picts and the Britons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that after defeating the Picts, Halfdan shared out the lands of the Northumbrians and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. So it can be said from this passage in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that the Vikings in Halfdan's portion of the army had permanently settled the land in Northumbria, and for many this is considered the beginning of what is called the Danelaw. So the Danelaw, as the name suggests, was the part of Britain which found itself subject to the Danes and their laws. Of course, some parts of Britain would come under the control of the Norse, but no distinction is made here. The Danelaw was by no means some great unified territory that sat in opposition to the Anglo-Saxons living next door. It was politically divided and there was a lot of cultural blending that went on. In the few years after Halfdan's settlement, by which it is meant that he became king and then took everyone else's land and gave it to his men, the eastern portion of Mercia was divided into what is known as the 5 boroughs. Each of these boroughs was ruled by a noble called a Jarl. The 5 boroughs were centred on 5 towns: Nottingham, Lincoln, Stamford, Leicester and Derby. All of these towns would go on to be extremely important regional centres later on, which is why all of them, barring Stamford, have their own counties named after them. As for East Anglia, Guthrum, who had just been baptised as Ethelstan after being defeated by King Alfred of Wessex, became its king. The creation of the Danelaw saw many social, demographic, cultural, religious and economic changes to the areas settled by the Danes. For starters, Danish law stated that the life of an Anglo-Saxon was worth less than that of a Dane. Alfred's treaty with Guthrum stated that in their respective kingdoms, Danes and Anglo-Saxons were to be viewed as equals. This equality did not apply to Britons though, who were still seen as inferior. One aspect of Danish rule was its pronounced effect on urbanisation. After the settlement of York by the Danes, it saw a steady period of population growth and importantly, the city's commercial centre expanded. Due in part to York's useful location along the route between Scandinavia and Ireland and partly due to the fact it was under Scandinavian control, York's importance in international trade grew swiftly. Workshops sprang up and housing shortages led to the building of 2-storey buildings, which shows just how developed Viking urban planning could be. This expansion went hand in hand with the economic prosperity that was seen under Danish rule. A part of this prosperity came from the fact that the Danish had settled and thus were no longer pillaging and stealing everything. The uptick in trade meant that some in the Danelaw began to mint their own coins, which gave the kings of the Danelaw greater legitimacy overseas. So the Danelaw did not just attempt to keep up with its neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but formed its own Anglo-Scandinavian culture. Fortunately for the Vikings, their language, Old Norse, was somewhat mutually intelligible with Old English, which meant that there weren't major barriers between them and the native Anglo-Saxons. This does not mean that there weren't major cultural differences between the two ethnic groups, the largest of which was religion. When they arrived, the Vikings were pagans worshipping numerous gods such as Odin, Freya or Thor, which was problematic for the Christian Anglo-Saxons and Celts already living in Britain. When they first arrived, the Vikings had no qualms with raiding and destroying church property in Britain. Churches were the main centres of learning at this point, which meant that many cultural works and laws did not survive the Viking raiding, which is why so much more is known about places such as Wessex than East Anglia or Northumbria. Evidence of major disruption to the church in pagan lands is seen by looking at many bishoprics. For example, the bishopric in East Anglia didn't reappear for nearly 100 years after Viking appearances, and the bishopric of Lindsey never returned. Pagans and Christians living side by side did create a multi-religious society. Many Vikings took Christian Anglo-Saxon wives, which meant that since women were in charge of raising children, many would have had at least a semi-Christian upbringing. This, coupled with the power and wealth of the church, meant that generally pagan beliefs were replaced by Christian ones within a couple of generations. One of the reasons that this is believed is that Viking-style burials are few and far between in the areas of the Danelaw, but this problem is compounded by the fact that no one knows just how many Vikings actually settled Britain. It could have been that the Vikings simply displaced the ruling Anglo-Saxon class, or that after settlement they brought their families over with them. One way of potentially telling how many Vikings settled is by looking at place names. As a very general rule, the names of Viking-founded towns tend to end in either B or Thorpe, such as Derby or Scunthorpe, whereas Anglo-Saxon towns tend to end in Tun, Ham or Bury, such as Luton, Buckingham or Shaftesbury. There are many exceptions to this rule, however, since many were simply renamed after the Vikings settled, such as Aorfawick, which became Jorvik. There are parts of the British Isles there were many Viking-style burials, however, and these are found for the most part in Scotland and Ireland, in the areas settled by the Norse. By the time of Guthrum's defeat by Alfred, the Shetland and Orkney Islands had been seized and settled by the Norse. The Norse moved further down the western coast of Scotland, conquering the Hebrides before reaching the Isle of Man, Ireland and Wales. In Ireland, the Vikings founded the fortification of Dublin in 841, which was abandoned in 902 and settled again in 917. Due to its central location, Dublin, as it was later known, quickly became an important trading city, particularly in the cargo of slaves. With respect to Anglo-Saxon politics, Dublin was an extremely important centre since it gave the Danes potential allies, but it's important to remember that all Vikings were by no means allies. An example being that due to the raiding by the Norse from Dublin, the Danish Northumbrians offered to make an alliance with Mercia against them. So the Viking position in what would later become England was weakened during the reign of Alfred the Great's successor, Edward the Elder, alongside his sister, Ethelfled. Through a series of conflicts, Edward was able to slowly wear away at the borders of the Danish until a series of victories allowed him to annex all of these lands by 918. In 927, Northumbria fell to Edward's successor, Ethelstan, and thus the only remaining Viking powers in the British Isles was that of the Norse. The Norse continued raiding and also occasionally cemented alliances with the Britons, such as those of the Kingdom of Strathclyde or the sort of kind of now semi-unified Kingdom of Alba, which would soon become Scotland. Northumbria would not stay under English rule without hiccups though. There was a series of conquests and reconquests of York by the English and the Norse over the course of the mid-10th century. The most famous Norse king of York was a man called Eric Bloodaxe. Two things about Eric. One, he had previously been deposed as the King of Norway, and two, his name is awesome but probably wasn't used by his contemporaries. His first reign began in 947, shortly after Eadred became King of the English. The Northumbrian nobility weren't too keen on being a part of a united England, and they took Eric as their king. In response, Eadred invaded and soon ravaged most of Northumbria, and Eric's supporters abandoned him, presumably because dying is terrible. Eric ran away and was soon replaced by the King of Dublin, Olaf, who reigned between 949 and 952 before himself being kicked out in favour of Eric again. Little is known about what kind of ruler Eric was, but he was ousted again in 954 before being killed in battle. Eadred then took over the ruling of Northumbria, which would never again be an independent kingdom and was incorporated into the Kingdom of the English. To some, the removal of Eric Bloodaxe marks the end of the Danelaw and the genuine beginning of England as a united political and cultural entity, but there are some problems with this. The first is that Danish law continued to be used long after Northumbria lost its independence. The second is that 954 was not the end of Scandinavian activity in Britain, not by a long shot. Northumbria's loyalty to the House of Wessex was not guaranteed, and many who lived in the old Danelaw were not opposed to the idea of a Danish ruler returning. And the return of a Danish ruler was something they would certainly get. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. If you'd like to know more about the Danelaw, there are some book recommendations in the description.